Hello everyone. Welcome to this episode. I am Jenny.
And I am Christopher.
In this episode, we will discuss environmental pollution and how to stop it. You can also share opinions in the comments. Let's start the conversation.
You know, Jenny, every time I read about environmental pollution, I feel like we're on this never-ending treadmill of destruction. It's everywhere, and sometimes it feels like there's no escape.
It's overwhelming for sure. I see it in the news: climate change, plastic in the oceans, air pollution. But what's frustrating is how helpless we feel. I mean, I recycle, I use a reusable water bottle, but does any of that even matter when it feels like governments and corporations are the ones making the real mess?
That's a common feeling, but the truth is, individual actions do matter. They might seem like drops in an ocean, but think of it this way: if millions of people made small changes, it would snowball into something huge. That said, you're right that the bigger picture involves systemic issues like industrial pollution, deforestation, and fossil fuel dependence. That's where policy changes and corporate responsibility come into play.
So, if I get you right, it's like we're doing the groundwork, but the heavy lifting has to come from those big players?
Exactly. Think of it as a partnership between individuals, governments, and corporations. But here's where it gets tricky: most people don't realize how interconnected everything is. The air pollution in one country can affect another. The plastic in the ocean isn't just a coastal issue, it impacts marine life globally, which in turn affects ecosystems and food chains. It's a cycle, and we're all part of it.
Yeah, I've heard that phrase, think global, act local, but it always seemed kind of abstract. What does it really mean in this context?
It means understanding the global impact of pollution but focusing on what you can change in your own community or lifestyle. For instance, pollution in urban areas contributes to global greenhouse gas emissions, which worsens climate change. If we can reduce car dependency in cities, for example, we can reduce local pollution. But it doesn't stop there. By doing that, we're also cutting down on fossil fuel consumption and reducing overall emissions on a broader scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. But cities aren't always built for that. I live 30 minutes away from work, and public transport is unreliable. It's not easy for everyone to just stop driving.
And that's where infrastructure comes in. Governments need to invest in better public transportation, bike lanes, and greener cities. It's a systemic issue, but people's demands and habits influence that. The more people push for these changes, the more likely they'll happen. And while we wait, you could try carpooling, driving an electric vehicle, or even walking and biking more when it's feasible.
That sounds reasonable, but what about air pollution? I remember seeing some news about how it's not just car emissions, but things like industrial factories and even agriculture that are major contributors. How do we even start tackling something that big?
You're absolutely right. Car emissions are just one part of the problem. Industrial pollution is a huge contributor to both air and water pollution. Factories release tons of carbon dioxide, methane, and other harmful gases into the atmosphere. Then there's agriculture, which most people don't even think of as a polluter, but it contributes to air pollution through livestock emissions, methane from cattle, for example, and the use of synthetic fertilizers, which release nitrous oxide.
So, are you saying even our food is polluting the air?
In a way, yes. Large-scale industrial farming contributes to environmental degradation, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, soil depletion, and water pollution from pesticide runoff. But that's why sustainable farming practices are so important. Supporting local farms, reducing meat consumption, and choosing organic products can all help reduce that impact.
But isn't organic food really expensive? I mean, I get the sustainability argument, but it feels like people are being priced out of making environmentally friendly choices.
That's a valid concern, and unfortunately, the cost is a barrier for many. Organic farming requires more labor, and because it doesn't use chemical pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, yields can be lower, making the products more expensive. But we can look at other ways to make a difference, like reducing food waste. Did you know that up to a third of the food produced globally is wasted? That contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions because when food decomposes in landfills, it releases methane, a potent greenhouse gas.
Wow, that's a lot of food. And methane's even worse than CO2, right?
Exactly. It traps heat in the atmosphere much more effectively. So reducing food waste, composting, and supporting sustainable agriculture can help mitigate that. Even meal planning and mindful shopping can make a huge difference.
Okay, so food's a big piece of the puzzle. But what about air pollution in places where it's almost impossible to avoid? Like, I've heard that people living in big cities, especially in places like India and China, are facing crazy levels of air pollution. That's not just factories, right? What else causes that?
In heavily populated areas, you're right, it's not just factories, it's also vehicle emissions, construction dust, burning of fossil fuels for energy, and even natural sources like dust storms. In cities with large populations and fast-growing industries, it can be incredibly hard to control. But one of the biggest issues there is the reliance on coal for electricity. Coal plants release enormous amounts of pollutants into the air, including particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and mercury.
So why don't we just stop using coal altogether and switch to something cleaner like solar or wind?
That would be ideal, but it's more complicated than that. Coal is still one of the cheapest sources of energy, and many countries, especially developing ones, rely on it to power their growing economies. The transition to renewable energy is expensive and requires massive infrastructure changes. Plus, solar and wind aren't perfect solutions either, they have their own environmental impacts, like the land required for wind farms or the mining needed for solar panels.
So, there's no magic bullet?
Unfortunately, no. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't make the switch. Renewable energy is still a much better option in the long term, and as technology improves, it's becoming more efficient and affordable. In the meantime, things like carbon capture technologies can help reduce the emissions from coal plants. And of course, pushing for more investment in renewables is crucial.
You mentioned earlier about plastic in the oceans. I know that's a big issue too, especially with things like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. But what can we really do about it? It seems like the ocean is so massive, and we're dumping so much plastic every day.
The plastic pollution crisis is one of the most visible forms of environmental degradation, and it's heartbreaking because plastic takes hundreds of years to decompose. It breaks down into tiny particles called microplastics, which are now found everywhere, from the deepest parts of the ocean to the food we eat and even the air we breathe.
Wait, microplastics are in the air too?
Yes. Studies have shown that they can travel through the atmosphere and be inhaled by humans and animals. It's terrifying to think that we're essentially breathing in plastic particles. And they're in our food supply because marine life ingests them. So, when we eat fish or seafood, we're also consuming microplastics.
Okay, that's disturbing. So, what can we actually do to stop this? Recycling is supposed to help, but I've heard a lot of it doesn't even get recycled.
You're right. A significant portion of plastic waste isn't recycled, it either ends up in landfills, incinerated, or worse, in the oceans. Part of the problem is that not all plastics are recyclable, and even when they are, the recycling infrastructure in many places isn't adequate. That's why the focus now is on reducing plastic production and use in the first place. Banning single-use plastics, encouraging reusable alternatives, and investing in biodegradable materials are some steps in the right direction.
So, is the key really just using less plastic?
That's a huge part of it, but there's also the need for better waste management systems globally. In many developing countries, waste disposal is poorly managed, and that's how a lot of plastic ends up in the ocean. Supporting initiatives that improve waste management and advocating for stronger regulations on plastic production are just as important as reducing our use.
That makes sense. But what about big companies? They produce so much plastic. Shouldn't they be responsible for cleaning up their mess?
Absolutely. There's a growing movement called Extended Producer Responsibility or EPR, which puts more accountability on companies to manage the waste from the products they create. Some countries are implementing policies that require companies to take back their packaging or products at the end of their life cycle. It's a way of making them more responsible for the entire life cycle of the materials they produce.
I like that idea. If they're making money off of it, they should be cleaning up after themselves too. But what about people like us who want to help? What's the best way to get involved and make a difference, beyond the small stuff like recycling?
There are lots of ways to get involved. You can join local environmental groups or support organizations that work on issues like ocean cleanup, reforestation, or sustainable agriculture. You can also get involved in advocacy, contact your local representatives, sign petitions, and push for stronger environmental laws. And don't underestimate the power of educating others. The more people who understand these issues, the more likely we are to create real change.
That's true. I've had some eye-opening moments just from this conversation. It feels less overwhelming when you break it down like this, even though the problems are massive.
I'm glad to hear that. It's easy to get bogged down in the doom and gloom, but there's a lot of hope too. We're at a point where people are more aware than ever, and that's the first step toward change. It's just a matter of keeping the momentum going.
You're right. I guess it's about doing what you can, where you can, and trying to push for those bigger changes too.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect, it's about progress. Every small step we take toward reducing pollution and protecting the environment counts, and if enough of us do it, the impact will be undeniable.
Our podcast for today is coming to an end. Please click the like button if you found the video helpful and subscribe to my channel.